The grand conference hall of the five-star hotel shimmered with quiet luxury, its crystal chandeliers casting warm golden light across polished marble floors and elegantly arranged seating. A long oval table stood at the center, surrounded by elite investors, influential board members, and carefully selected media representatives, all dressed in impeccable formal attire. Soft murmurs filled the air as assistants moved discreetly, placing documents, tablets, and glasses of water before each guest. Everyone present understood the significance of the gathering. The company was on the verge of announcing a major expansion deal, one that promised to push it beyond national success and into the global spotlight. Anticipation lingered in every glance and whispered exchange, as fortunes, reputations, and alliances seemed to hang delicately in the balance. Yet beneath the polished professionalism, tension quietly brewed. Several investors exchanged knowing looks, their conversations dipping into cautious speculation about internal dynamics. The CEO was known for his bold leadership, but there were persistent rumors that the true strength of the company came from someone rarely seen: his wife. Though she seldom attended public events, her influence was undeniable. It was said that her strategic decisions and financial backing had shaped the company's rise from the shadows. Her absence today did not go unnoticed. In fact, it made the atmosphere feel even heavier, as if an unseen presence still held power over the room. As the clock ticked forward, all eyes occasionally drifted toward the grand entrance doors, waiting for the man who believed he controlled it all to finally arrive. Even the subtle sound of heels against marble seemed louder than usual, echoing the impatience growing within the room. Every second of delay only deepened the curiosity, making his entrance feel less like routine and more like the beginning of something significant moment. The low hum of conversation abruptly softened as the grand double doors at the end of the hall swung open with quiet authority. Every head turned almost instinctively, as if the room itself recognized the presence that had just entered. The CEO stepped inside with a measured, confident stride, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble floor. His tailored suit fit him flawlessly, every detail, from the crisp lines of his jacket to the subtle gleam of his cufflinks, projecting wealth, precision, and control. A faint, self-assured smile rested on his lips as his sharp eyes scanned the room, acknowledging the attention without appearing surprised by it. He walked as though he belonged not just in the room, but above it, as though every person seated there was already under his command. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his posture. Confidence radiated from him so naturally that it almost felt rehearsed, perfected over years of success and influence. Several investors nodded respectfully, offering polite greetings, while others exchanged subtle glances behind his back. They admired what he had built, the rapid rise of the company, the bold risks that had paid off, but there was always something else lingering beneath that admiration. A quiet recognition of his arrogance, of how easily confidence had turned into ego. He seemed aware of it. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it. As he approached the head of the table, his pace slowed slightly, allowing the moment to stretch, as if he were savoring the weight of every eye on him. His presence filled the space effortlessly, dominating not just physically, but psychologically. When he finally reached his seat, he didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood tall for a brief moment longer, his expression calm yet commanding, silently reinforcing what he already believed. This was his company, his stage, his moment. And in his mind, there was no one in that room who could challenge that. Just as the room began to settle into a controlled silence, a subtle shift in attention rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the CEO alone who had captured their focus, but the figure walking beside him. At first, it was only a few lingering glances, curious and uncertain. Then, as she stepped fully into the light, the reaction became impossible to ignore. She was striking, dressed in a sleek, form-fitting outfit that spoke of luxury and deliberate elegance. She carried herself with effortless confidence. Every step she took was precise, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the hushed hall. Her posture was flawless, her expression calm, yet subtly amused, as if she were completely aware of the effect she was having on everyone around her. Whispers began almost instantly. Investors leaned slightly toward one another, exchanging quick, discreet remarks behind carefully controlled expressions. Some frowned in confusion, others raised their brows in silent speculation. No one recognized her, and that alone was enough to spark curiosity. In a room filled with powerful individuals who made it their business to know everything and everyone, her unfamiliar presence stood out sharply. But it wasn't just curiosity. For those who knew the CEO's personal life, something else crept in: suspicion. A few exchanged sharper glances now, their attention shifting between the woman and the man walking beside her with unmistakable ease. There was a closeness in their body language, an unspoken familiarity that did not belong in a professional setting. It raised questions no one dared to ask aloud, yet everyone seemed to be thinking at the same time. The tension in the room thickened, no longer hidden beneath polite smiles. What began as curiosity was quickly transforming into quiet judgment, hanging heavily in the air as all eyes remained fixed on the unexpected guest who had just walked into a room where she clearly did not belong. The tension in the room had barely settled when the CEO came to a stop near the head of the table, his expression as relaxed as ever. He glanced around at the gathered investors, clearly aware of the curiosity that had taken hold of them. Instead of easing it, he seemed to lean into it, almost amused by the silent questions filling the air. "Good morning, everyone," he said smoothly, his voice calm and controlled, as if nothing about the moment was unusual. A few polite greetings followed, though they were noticeably quieter than before. Attention remained fixed not on his words, but on the woman standing beside him. He let the silence stretch just enough to heighten the anticipation, then casually gestured toward her, his movement slow and deliberate. "Before we begin," he continued, a faint smile playing on his lips, "I'd like you all to meet someone important." The room seemed to hold its breath. "This is Vanessa," he said, pausing just briefly, as though savoring the moment. "My fiancée." For a split second, there was complete silence. Then, like a ripple breaking across still water, soft gasps spread throughout the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged sharp, disbelieving glances. The word lingered heavily in the air, refusing to settle. Fiancée. It didn't make sense. Several investors lowered their voices into hurried whispers, their composure cracking under the weight of what they had just heard. Eyes darted from one face to another, silently asking the same question. What about his wife? The confusion quickly deepened into something more serious. This wasn't just a personal matter, it had the potential to become a public scandal, one that could damage reputations and shake the very foundation of the company. A few board members looked particularly uneasy, their expressions tightening as they began to grasp the implications. And yet, at the center of it all, Vanessa remained perfectly composed. A confident smile curved her lips as she took in the reactions around her, her posture relaxed, almost proud. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no sign of discomfort. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the attention, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. She had no idea that beneath the shock, beneath the whispers and uneasy glances, something far more dangerous was beginning to stir, something that would soon turn this carefully controlled moment into a storm none of them were prepared for. The moment his words settled, the room no longer felt like a place of business. It shifted into something far more fragile, where professionalism struggled to hold its ground against curiosity and disbelief. The quiet murmurs that followed were no longer subtle. They carried weight, urgency, and a growing sense of unease. Investors leaned closer to one another, their voices low but persistent. Carefully chosen words masked deeper concerns, yet their expressions revealed everything. Some shook their heads slightly, others narrowed their eyes in thought, already calculating the potential consequences of what they had just witnessed. This was not just a personal revelation, it was a public misstep, one that could ripple through the company's reputation. At the far end of the table, a few senior board members sat in tense silence, their discomfort far more visible. Their rigid posture and tightened expressions spoke of concern, not surprise. It was as if this moment had confirmed doubts they had quietly carried for some time. One of them adjusted his glasses, glancing toward the CEO with a look that questioned not just his actions, but his judgment. Because this wasn't just about introducing another woman. It was about timing, control, and awareness, qualities a leader was expected to possess without question. A few investors exchanged more serious looks now, their attention drifting between the CEO and the empty space that seemed to linger in the room. The absence of his wife, once just a passing curiosity, began to feel deliberate, significant, even strategic. There were rumors, after all. Rumors that she was more than just a distant figure in his life. That her influence extended far deeper into the company than most people realized. That behind the CEO's bold decisions, there had always been another mind guiding the direction. And now, with her absence paired against this unexpected introduction, the balance felt off. For the first time since he had entered the room, a quiet but undeniable question began to take shape in the minds of those present. Was he truly the one in control? Just as the murmurs began to blur into a restless hum and the tension reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, the grand doors at the far end of the hall opened once again. This time, there was no dramatic sound, no forceful interruption, just a quiet, deliberate movement that somehow commanded more attention than any bold entrance could have. At first, only a few people noticed. Then, one by one, heads began to turn. The conversations faded mid-sentence, as if an invisible signal had passed through the room. The air itself seemed to still, anticipation shifting into something deeper, something heavier. Even those who had been whispering most intently fell silent, their attention drawn toward the figure now stepping inside. She walked in with unhurried grace. There was no rush in her steps, no need to announce herself. Her presence spoke before she ever did. Dressed in refined elegance, every detail of her appearance reflected quiet power rather than display. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, her gaze steady and observant as it moved across the room. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. If anything, she looked prepared. The soft echo of her footsteps against the marble floor seemed louder than it should have been, each step reinforcing the shift that was taking place. The golden light from the chandeliers framed her figure as she moved forward, and with every inch she advanced, the authority she carried became more undeniable. At the table, several investors straightened instinctively. Some lowered their eyes. Others watched her carefully, as if reassessing everything they thought they understood. The board members who had shown concern earlier now appeared almost relieved. And at the center of it all, the CEO stood still. For the first time, there was a flicker of something uncertain in his expression. Because this was not just his wife walking into the room. This was the presence that had been missing. The force that had never needed to be loud to be powerful. Without raising her voice, without making a single demand, she had already done something no one else in that room could. She had taken control. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed her entrance was no longer filled with curiosity. It was sharp, expectant, almost suffocating. All eyes shifted between the three figures now standing at the center of the room, as if everyone understood that whatever happened next would change everything. The CEO straightened slightly, as though reminding himself of where he stood. The flicker of uncertainty that had crossed his face disappeared almost as quickly as it came, replaced by a forced composure. He adjusted his cufflink with deliberate calm, his expression tightening into something controlled, almost dismissive. "You're here," he said, his tone light, but lacking its earlier ease. "I wasn't expecting you." It was an attempt, subtle, but clear, to frame her presence as unnecessary, even inconvenient. As though this was still his stage, and she had simply walked in uninvited. But she didn't react. She simply stopped a few steps away, her gaze steady as it moved from him to the woman beside him. Vanessa, who had carried herself with such confidence moments ago, shifted slightly in her seat. The amused smile that once rested on her lips began to fade, replaced by something less certain. Her posture stiffened, her eyes flickering briefly toward the CEO, as if searching for reassurance that no longer felt as solid as it had before. The wife's voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, unshaken. "I heard the introduction," she said, her tone even, almost conversational. "I just wanted to be sure I understood it correctly." A quiet tension snapped through the room. The CEO gave a small, dismissive chuckle, waving his hand lightly, as if brushing away the weight of her words. "It's nothing that concerns this meeting," he replied. "We're here for business." But the response came too quickly, too carefully, and everyone noticed. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unchanged, yet her presence pressing harder against the fragile control he was trying to maintain. "Business," she repeated softly. "Then it should concern me." That was the moment it shifted. The confidence he had worn so effortlessly began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for those watching to see beneath it. His jaw tightened, his posture no longer as relaxed as before. The room held its breath, caught between disbelief and anticipation. Because this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a confrontation. And for the first time, it was clear that his control over the situation was slipping. The tension in the room tightened to an almost unbearable degree, every second stretching as all attention remained fixed on her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't step forward aggressively, and yet the quiet control she carried made it impossible for anyone to look away. Even the air seemed to pause, as if waiting for her next words. The CEO let out a short breath, attempting to recover what little composure he had left. "This isn't the time," he said, his tone firmer now, though the strain beneath it was impossible to hide. "We can discuss this later." But she didn't move. Instead, she reached calmly toward the table, her fingers brushing against one of the neatly arranged folders that had been prepared for the meeting. With effortless precision, she opened it, glancing briefly at its contents before lifting her gaze back to the room. "I think," she said quietly, "this is exactly the time." A ripple of unease moved through the investors. Several leaned forward, their curiosity now overtaking any attempt at restraint. The board members exchanged sharp looks, already sensing what was about to unfold. She closed the folder gently and let her hand rest against the table, grounding her presence. "For years," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "there's been a misunderstanding about how this company operates and who it truly belongs to." The CEO's expression hardened. "That's enough," he interrupted, stepping forward slightly. "You're making this unnecessarily dramatic." But she didn't even glance at him this time. Instead, she addressed the room. "I am the majority shareholder of this company," she said, her tone unwavering. "The controlling stake, the strategic investments, the silent acquisitions that allowed this business to grow at the pace it did, all of it was authorized by me." For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the reaction hit. A sharp intake of breath. A chair shifting abruptly. A quiet but unmistakable gasp that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. The weight of her words settled heavily across the room, breaking through any remaining doubt. Investors began flipping through the documents in front of them with sudden urgency, eyes scanning figures and signatures that now carried an entirely different meaning. Pieces began to fall into place, decisions that had once seemed unusually bold, funding that had appeared at critical moments, strategies that had felt too precise to be coincidence. It all connected, and it led back to her. At the center of it all, the CEO stood frozen. The confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. His authority, once unquestioned, began to crumble in real time as the room shifted its focus away from him. Not slowly, not subtly, but completely. Because in a single, composed statement, she hadn't just revealed the truth. She had taken everything back. The moment her words hung in the air, the room seemed to tilt. The CEO's posture, once rigid and commanding, slackened subtly, though enough to reveal the cracks that had been forming beneath the surface. A faint tremor ran through his hands as he straightened his jacket for the third time, an almost comical attempt to maintain an illusion of control. But it was too late. The carefully constructed image of power he had spent years cultivating was dissolving in front of everyone. Investors who had once nodded politely at his remarks now began to shift in their seats. Papers were shuffled, tablets subtly repositioned, and glances that had once signaled trust or admiration turned toward cautious evaluation. Their allegiance was no longer guaranteed. Quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, some began whispering to their colleagues, reassessing the man they had so recently viewed as the unshakable leader of the room. The board members who had maintained silent concern now subtly realigned. A few exchanged knowing looks, and then, without fanfare, began leaning slightly toward the wife's side of the table. They no longer hid their recognition of where the real authority rested. Their loyalty, once implicit, had now shifted decisively, leaving the CEO increasingly isolated. Vanessa, who had previously smiled with confidence, now stiffened slightly, her expression tightening as she realized the stakes had escalated far beyond personal intrigue. Panic flitted across her features for a brief moment, the amusement replaced by anxiety. She had been unaware of the depth of the wife's power and influence, and the revelation made her feel dangerously exposed. The CEO, meanwhile, could feel it all. The stares, the whispers, the subtle distancing of those he had believed were firmly under his sway. He had walked in expecting admiration, control, and dominance, yet now he stood humiliated, stripped bare before the very people he had sought to impress. The room no longer belonged to him. The illusion of authority had shattered, leaving him vulnerable, exposed, and utterly defeated in silence. As the room absorbed the shock of her revelation, she didn't raise her voice, didn't make dramatic gestures, and didn't demand attention. Instead, she let the silence settle, allowing the weight of her presence to speak volumes. Every eye in the room was on her, every mind acutely aware that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Investors and board members waited, tense but attentive, recognizing that the next words would determine the future of the company and the fate of the man who had once seemed untouchable. She spoke clearly and deliberately, outlining steps that were both precise and unassailable. Decisions that had once been quietly influenced by her behind the scenes were now confirmed openly, leaving no room for doubt. She proposed adjustments to leadership roles, subtly limiting the CEO's authority while preserving decorum and professionalism. Her voice never wavered, her tone never aggressive. It was calm, firm, and undeniably commanding. Some investors nodded appreciatively, realizing that her judgment was steady and fair, not driven by personal vendetta. Board members adjusted their positions, openly supporting her leadership and signaling a realignment of loyalty. The Mistress, previously confident and self-assured, now sat frozen, realizing the depth of her miscalculation. In this quiet, composed manner, justice unfolded, not through chaos or dramatic confrontation, but through measured authority. By asserting control with precision and poise, she demonstrated that true power lies not in ego or theatrics, but in competence, foresight, and the ability to act decisively. By the end of the meeting, it was unmistakably clear. She was the one who truly commanded respect, and the CEO's era of unchecked dominance had come to a definitive, irreversible end. As the meeting concluded and the room slowly emptied, the echoes of that day lingered far longer than anyone had anticipated. The CEO, once a figure of unwavering confidence, had been unmasked not by rage or confrontation, but by the quiet, deliberate strength of a woman who understood the true meaning of power. Her presence alone had shifted the balance, her calm authority proving that influence does not always need to shout to be felt. The lesson was clear: power is not always loud. True authority comes from knowledge, patience, and the ability to act decisively when the moment demands it. Ego may give a fleeting sense of control, but respect, earned and sustained, carries far greater weight. Those who betray trust, manipulate situations, or underestimate the quiet strength of others are bound to face consequences, often when they least expect it. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need revenge. The truth, revealed with composure and precision, was enough to restore balance, command respect, and redefine authority. In the end, it was not anger that triumphed, but patience, foresight, and timing. Sometimes, the quietest actions speak the loudest, and the most powerful victories are won without a single raised voice. Justice had been served, not with chaos, but with silent strength.